Open any major newspaper in June 2026, and you will see an economy under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The state is absorbing violent energy price shocks, managing structural trade imbalances that drain domestic manufacturing, and navigating a sudden shift in how long-term global alliances operate. Military skirmishes, tax exemptions, and changes in solar subsidies are frequently treated as isolated news items. That view is mechanically incorrect. This diagram maps the actual architecture of state economic planning, a macro policy matrix where tax codes and treaties interact as a highly sensitive system. Through this lens, recent policy shifts are revealed as calculated hedges defending sovereign economic capacity against external shocks. We can trace this causality across three specific theaters. First, we will examine how violent conflict in West Asia dictates the precise rewriting of domestic capital market regulations. Second, we will look at international trade architecture, exploring the mathematical paradox where expanding zero-tariff agreements actually cannibalizes local industry. Third, we will analyze the pivot to electric transit and decentralized solar, and why this transition requires securing deep-tier mineral supply chains. In the current global economic environment, the margin for policy error has dropped to absolute zero. Surviving this decade requires treating the nation as an integrated machine, where a minor localized tax adjustment executes a highly targeted global strategic intent. To see how this machine responds to stress, look at the renewed escalation of conflict between Iran and Israel. 100 days into this standoff, the threat to commercial shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz is severe. The immediate market reaction is physical. Tanker insurance premiums spike, and crude oil pricing becomes highly erratic. That international volatility translates directly into domestic friction. We have recorded a second round of household LPG and petrol price hikes in just 3 months. For the state, this creates an acute fiscal threat. Elevated energy prices drastically inflate the domestic subsidy burden required to insulate the poorest populations. Internationally, expensive oil exerts massive pressure on India's current account deficit. The country is bleeding foreign exchange simply to keep its logistical grid operational. The state cannot control the Strait of Hormuz, but it can control its own capital markets. In direct response to these pressures, SEBI and the Finance Ministry deployed a rapid macroeconomic countermeasure, targeted tax exemptions for foreign institutional investors. This flowchart isolates the mechanism. The government removed long-term capital gains and withholding tax on foreign investments entering Indian government bonds. The architecture was rewritten with a single goal: forcing the inclusion of Indian sovereign bonds into the Bloomberg Global Aggregate Bond Index. Index inclusion executes a mechanical guarantee. Passive global funds tracking the Bloomberg Index are mathematically obligated to purchase Indian sovereign debt to balance their portfolios. The quantitative payoff for this structural adjustment is an estimated $30 to $50 billion in stable, long-term inflows. Active foreign investment flees at the first sign. Mandated index inflows provide system-level stability, immune to daily sentiment. The state is manipulating domestic capital taxation to capture global passive dollars, effectively using financial architecture to hedge against physical oil shocks. That same logic of mechanical adjustment applies to trade. India currently operates 15 active free trade agreements across 27 nations, with 9 more under negotiation. The stated policy goal is export dominance. The statistical reality is a severe deficit. Between 2007 and 2025, the trade deficit with ASEAN alone expanded by 381%. Expanding zero-tariff access often damages the domestic industrial base because of a specific structural inefficiency in the tax code. This ledger illustrates the core systemic flaw. It compares the taxation on industrial inputs against the taxation on completed products entering the country. Notice the disparity. Raw industrial inputs face higher import duties than fully manufactured goods. This is an inverted duty structure. Consider a domestic manufacturer in Ghaziabad producing PVC pipes, competing against a firm importing those exact same pipes from an ASEAN nation. To run his factory, the domestic manufacturer must import raw PVC resin. Under the current tax code, that raw input triggers a 5 to 10% tariff penalty. His competitor relies on an FTA. They import the fully finished PVC pipe from Thailand or Vietnam and incur zero tariff. Because the domestic producer is taxed heavily on inputs while the importer pays nothing, localized value addition becomes unprofitable. Manufacturers respond rationally to bad incentives. They either shut down domestic lines or offshore physical production to countries like Vietnam to exploit FTA loopholes. When local firms do try to export, they hit a secondary layer of bureaucratic friction. The heavy compliance costs associated with proving rules of origin frequently wipe out any remaining tariff advantages for small businesses. By combining aggressive FTAs with inverted domestic duties, the current architecture enforces a Make in ASEAN, Sell in India reality, cannibalizing sovereign industrial capacity. The third theater is the pivot toward renewable infrastructure. This is primarily executed through decentralized solar grids under schemes like PM-Suryagar and PM-KUSUM, alongside a major push for electric vehicles. However, the rollout reveals severe regional friction. States like Gujarat report high adoption rates for agricultural solar pumps, while implementation in Bihar has stalled. The root cause is overlapping state policies. In regions where electricity is already provided free to the agricultural sector, the financial incentive for a farmer to invest upfront in solar infrastructure is eliminated. The macroeconomic advantage of this transition is clear when analyzing the shift from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. Once on the road, an electric vehicle severs the state's recurring dependency on imported fossil fuels. It does not require a weekly infusion of foreign oil to function. This map tracks the critical geopolitical caveat to that transition. Swapping an oil dependency for a battery dependency merely shifts the nation's vulnerability from West Asia to China. Relying on a single external source for rare earths and battery cells creates a monopolized structural point of failure. Defending the system requires hard sovereign mechanisms, like the National Critical Mineral Mission and closed-loop battery recycling protocols. True energy sovereignty is not achieved by merely adopting green technology endpoints. It requires securing absolute control over the deep-tier mineral supply chains building them. Look at the complete matrix. Energy hedging, trade architecture reform, and green supply chain security form a unified, defensive macroeconomic posture. In 2026, state economic autonomy relies on these precise mechanical adjustments rather than broad ideological alignment. This structural reality dictates international diplomacy. The era of securing national interests through sweeping, sentiment-driven strategic alliances has ended. The defining characteristic of modern diplomacy is cold-eyed transactionalism. We see this explicitly in the current iteration of the US-India relationship. Interactions are now strictly limited to measurable quid pro quo negotiations. Strategic autonomy means bargaining hard for specific technology transfers and market access, line by line. Global capital flight, collapsing trade architecture, and critical mineral monopolies are unforgiving forces. They will crush any system that lacks defensive structural integrity. Success in this environment requires the policy architect to align localized domestic friction points with brutal international realities. Sovereignty in the 21st century is an engineering problem. It is meticulously constructed through tax codes, capital controls, and sovereign supply chain ownership.